Hi everyone, my name is Henk, and in this video I'll be doing a walkthrough of the things that I look for when deciding whether or not to invest in a particular company. And I'm also going to do an intrinsic calculation for a particular company to see whether or not it has a good price to buy in. For this particular example, I'll be looking at the New Zealand company Mainfreight. Now, the first thing that we want to decide is whether or not Mainfreight has a significant moat. And what I mean by moat is whether or not they have a barrier to entry that prevents the competition just taking them over. And what I mean by that is, for example, Apple and Coca-Cola have their famous brand. And for example, Amazon has their giant logistic network. And we want to see whether or not Mainfreight has something like that. So let's look a little bit into the company itself. So Mainfreight began its operation in Auckland in 1978. So they've been around for a reasonably long time. They're one of the biggest logistics companies in New Zealand with around $3.6 billion market cap. They do transport of domestic goods, products, hazardous products, liquid goods. They also have temperature-controlled transport vehicles for temperature-sensitive goods. They do air freight, sea freight, and also warehouse inventory management. They expanded to Australia in the 1980s and currently have operation in Asia, Europe, and the US. Due to their extensive logistics network, I would say that they have a pretty decent sized moat, which prevents competition from just entering the market and taking a giant slice of their market share. And one of the other reasons that I was interested in this company was that Mainfreight operated throughout lockdown, where a lot of other businesses have not been able to function the same way. So the next thing that I will want to do is to jump on Yahoo Finance and look up Mainfreight. So the first thing to notice here is that Mainfreight has a market cap of around 3.6 billion. Now, as a general rule, I don't particularly like to invest in companies that has a small market cap. And by what I mean by small market cap is that they have a market cap of less than $300 million. Now, Mainfreight is much bigger than that, which is a good sign. So they have a P/E ratio here of 25.5. Now, P/E ratio by itself doesn't actually tell you a whole lot about the company. So you have to compare it with other companies within the same sector. So I looked up the different companies in the transportation sector in New Zealand, and we can see that Mainfreight has a P/E ratio of around 25, and that is reasonably high compared to the most of the other companies that are in the same transportation sector, which may mean that Mainfreight could be a little bit overpriced. The next thing that I want to look at is the earnings per share for Mainfreight. So Mainfreight has an earnings per share of $1.4 per share. And again, this number by itself doesn't tell you too much about the company. You have to compare it with other companies within the same sector. So going back to the transportation sector in New Zealand, we can see that the Mainfreight earnings per share of 1.4 is actually pretty good compared to other companies within the same sector. So this is definitely a good sign. Let's now dive into the statistics for Mainfreight. So there's quite a few different figures that we're interested here. So the first one is their return on equity. So Mainfreight has a return on equity of 17%, and this is not a particularly high number. Ideally, a reasonable return on equity for a company is something that's more than 20%. And basically, the higher the return on equity, the better. Going down the list, we can see the current ratio for Mainfreight at 1.11. This shows that Mainfreight has slightly more current assets than current liabilities, which means that if it's required, that Mainfreight can sell off their assets to cover their liabilities. And ideally, you really want to look for a company that has a current ratio of more than 1. In the share statistics box, we should pay attention to the percentage of shares held by the insiders. And what it means by insiders are basically people that have knowledge of the inner workings of the company, which may include the CEOs and the upper management for the company. So you want a company where the upper management holds some amount of shares for the company to show that they're still actively invested in the company. So Mainfreight has 19.5% of their shares are held by insiders, which is a good sign. Going down, we can see the dividends for Mainfreight, and Mainfreight has a dividend yield of 1.63%, which is quite low compared to many other New Zealand companies. So they might not be the best company to invest in if you are a dividend investor. Mainfreight has a payout ratio of 39.98%, which means that they still have 60% of their revenue for possible future development. Let's now have a look at the price chart for Mainfreight. So as a general rule, I like to look at the last couple of years in terms of share prices instead of the last year, because the longer term give you a more broad view of how the company share price is doing. So let's look at the past 5 years. And the blue line here is the New Zealand Top 50 Company Index. So we can see that Mainfreight has done reasonably well when compared to the New Zealand Index over the past 5 years, with its main dip corresponding with the economic downturn that has happened recently. Now let's go through how to calculate the intrinsic value for Mainfreight. So I've updated the intrinsic value calculation spreadsheet a little bit so that when you enter the stock name ticker, it will automatically pull up the stock price and earnings per share from the Google Finance database. So to enter the Mainfreight, ticker is NZ Exchange and MFT, and this will automatically bring up the stock price and the earnings per share for Mainfreight. To find the growth rate for the company, we're going back into Yahoo Finance, and we're going to be looking in the Analysis tab, and we're going to scroll down to find the next 5-year growth estimate for Mainfreight. So the next 5-year estimate is 13.6. And enter. And we'll keep the rate of return and margin of safety at 50%. The next thing that we're going to do is to do a manual estimate of the future PE ratio. And in order to do that, we're going to go to MSM Money. And the reason why we use MSM Money is because Mainfreight is a New Zealand company. And MSM Money gives more details on New Zealand companies compared to some other financial websites. So I want to look up Mainfreight, which is MFT. And in the analysis box, I want to go to price ratio. So to do a manual estimate of the price ratio for the company, I'll be looking at this teal line, which is the average PE ratio for the company. So just look through the teal line and get a rough estimate of kind of in the middle of where the PE ratio would be. So I can see that they have a high of around 655, and a low of around 10. So the rough average P of Mainfreight would be around the 25 to 30 area. So for my manual estimate, I'm going to use 27.5. So this is just a very rough manual estimate. So next thing that we're going to do is look for the 5-year P high, which is 56.42. Copy that. And then we're going to look for the 5-year low, 17.98. Cool. So now the spreadsheet should automatically populate with the intrinsic value and the suggested buy price. So we're using a rate of return of 15% and margin of safety of 50%. Overall, you want to be a little bit more conservative with your future P ratio estimates. So here, the lowest value of future P that we get is from 2 times the growth rate. So that's the one that we're going to be most interested in. I've also included an intrinsic value calculation using the formula by Benjamin Graham, who's the author for the Intelligent Investor. And it comes up with a buy price of $43.29, which is higher than the stock price, which suggests that the Mainfreight company stock is undervalued. Using the ratio-based intrinsic value calculation with the 2 times growth rate, I got a buy price of 17.91, which meant that the Mainfreight is overvalued. Overall, I tend to be a little bit more conservative when deciding whether or not to invest in a particular company. So in the situation where there are conflicting buying signals, I tend to be more on the side of caution and not invest straight away. But the goal of all this is not to tell you whether or not you should buy a particular company, but to go over the things that you want to look for when deciding whether to buy a company or not. So I hope this has been useful for you, and I'll see you in the next video.